30 people could see the map. Only one of them was willing to interrupt the general. The man who did it was 22-year-old Corporal Daniel Kovac, a junior enlisted soldier standing near the back of a 3rd Army staff briefing. At the front of the room, General George S. Patton was tracing a route across an operational overlay and explaining how part of his army was expected to move. Daniel believed the route contained a mistake. Not a dramatic mistake. Not a bridge blown out or a town under the wrong flag. A road junction on the map no longer matched the road network on the ground. And in a mechanized army moving fast through unfamiliar territory, that was enough. The account behind this story is not an archival transcript, so its exact dialogue and several personal details should not be treated as independently verified. But its central claim is simple. A young corporal challenged a map in front of Patton's staff. The correction was accepted, and the corporal was promoted soon afterward. What makes the story interesting is not the promotion. It is the silence before the correction. The source places the episode during 3rd Army planning in Europe in 1944. A staff briefing at that level was built around rank, responsibility, and speed. Information moved upward through a chain. Decisions moved downward through it. A corporal did not normally stand in the same institutional space as colonels and generals, even if he happened to be standing in the same room. That matters because the map on the wall was not decoration. It was a compressed version of roads, bridges, towns, gradients, intersections, and distances that thousands of men might soon be ordered to trust. A line drawn in the wrong place could become trucks waiting at a dead end. It could become armor losing contact with its support. It could become fuel burned while a column turned around on a road never designed to hold that much traffic. The source says Daniel noticed one of those small errors. The operational overlay showed a junction in one position. Daniel believed the real road network placed it somewhere else. The account attributes the mismatch to pre-war reconstruction that had altered the local roads after the cartographic information used for the overlay had been produced. A map does not become false all at once. It becomes false in pieces. A road is widened. A bridge is replaced. An intersection is rebuilt. A flood changes what a town repairs first. The paper may still be useful across 99% of the sheet, while the 1% that change becomes exactly the place where a convoy is told to turn. That is why source dates matter. A staff can have an accurate scale, a clean overlay, and a sensible route, yet still inherit one local error from the material underneath it. The mistake may be tiny on paper and large only when vehicles begin arriving at the place the paper described. That detail mattered to Daniel because the source also gives him a background in surveying and drafting before the Army. Survey work trains attention toward disagreement. The job is not to admire the map. It is to ask whether the line, angle, distance, and landmark correspond to the physical ground. A surveyor learns that an official-looking drawing can still be outdated, incomplete, or simply wrong. Daniel's value in that room then was not secret knowledge. It was a habit of verification. He checked the location again. Then he checked it a second time. Around him were officers with more rank, more service, and more authority to speak than he had. The account does not let us know what any of those men privately thought. It only gives us the visible fact that no one else interrupted the briefing before Daniel did. He raised his hand. That gesture created a problem larger than the map. If Daniel was wrong, he had interrupted the commanding general in front of the 3rd Army staff and questioned a plan he was barely senior enough to observe. If Daniel was right, then everyone in the room had a different problem. The Army was about to act on bad information. That is the pressure point in the story. Rank existed for a reason. Combat organizations cannot function if every order becomes an open debate. But discipline and accuracy are not the same thing. A chain of command can organize action, yet still fail if people inside it become more afraid of passing bad news upward than of watching bad information move downward. Daniel spoke. The exact words are not verifiable from the supplied account, so the safest way to describe the moment is this. He told Patton that he believed the map was wrong. The room stopped. Patton had a public reputation for force, speed, and intolerance of hesitation. The source itself does not ask us to imagine him as a patient man. That is why the next beat matters. According to the account, Patton did not dismiss the corporal. He asked him to demonstrate the error. Daniel came forward. Now the geography of the room changed. A moment earlier, he had been a low-ranking figure near the wall. Now he was standing at the map table, pointing to the same section of overlay the commanding general had been using to brief his officers. He explained the road junction as he understood it. He identified the mismatch between the overlay and the reconstructed road network. He tied the error to the age of the cartographic source. He did not need a speech. He needed the map to survive contact with the ground. Patton checked the area. The account says he examined the overlay notation and accepted the correction. Then the staff changed the route. No ceremony, no dramatic confrontation, no colonel publicly humiliated. The planning problem was corrected and the briefing moved on. That restraint is important, because the story becomes weaker if it is turned into a scene about a fearless corporal defeating a room full of timid officers. That is not what the source actually proves. It does not prove who else saw the problem. It does not prove why anyone else stayed silent. It does not prove that a disaster was seconds away. And it does not prove that Daniel alone understood maps better than every officer present. What it does claim is narrower and more useful. He saw a discrepancy. He had a reason to trust his technical judgment. He accepted the personal risk of saying so. Patton tested the information instead of rejecting it because of the rank attached to the messenger. The map was corrected. That is enough. The following day, according to the source, Daniel learned that he had been promoted from corporal to sergeant. The account presents the promotion as a direct response to what happened in the briefing. Without external records, that connection cannot be treated as independently confirmed. But as the story is told, the reason was not simply that Daniel knew something about roads. An army can train people to read maps. It is harder to create a culture in which the person who notices a dangerous contradiction believes he is allowed to report it. The promotion in that reading rewarded judgment under pressure. That does not make every objection equally valuable. The story works because Daniel's intervention is specific, testable, and tied to evidence. A command cannot operate on endless opinion, but it can create a path for checkable correction. Daniel had not challenged authority for the sake of challenging it. He had brought a specific claim, based on specific knowledge, at a moment when the cost of ignoring it belonged to men who were not in the room. That distinction matters in military planning. The faster an army moves, the less time it has to absorb friction. A slow correction can be expensive. A misjunction can become a traffic problem. A traffic problem can become a fuel problem. A fuel problem can become a timing problem. And a timing problem can separate units that were supposed to arrive together. The people caught in that chain may never know where the first error began. A driver sees only the wrong turn. A traffic control soldier sees vehicles backing up. A commander farther forward sees a unit arriving late. Each level experiences a different symptom of the same bad piece of information. That is why staff accuracy has a different kind of drama from combat. Its successes often disappear. When a route is corrected early, there may be no heroic scene afterward. Nothing explodes. No one knows which delay never formed. The evidence of good work is often the absence of a problem that would have been obvious only after it became expensive. None of that requires a spectacular battlefield mistake. It can begin with a small mark on paper. The source uses Third Army speed across Europe as the larger frame for the incident. That speed is often remembered through moving columns, aggressive maneuvers, and Patton's personality. But fast operations also depend on less dramatic work: staff estimates, road information, traffic control, fuel planning, bridge data, and constant correction when the map stops matching reality. In that world, a map specialist or survey-trained soldier did not need to fire a weapon to affect movement. He needed to keep the representation honest. That is also why the story should not be turned into a simple celebration of Patton. Even the supplied account acknowledges that Patton could be harsh, and that other episodes do not fit a neat picture of a commander who always welcomed contradiction. The value of this moment, if the account is accurate, lies precisely in its specificity. Here in this room, he tested the claim. Here the rank of the messenger did not erase the content of the message. Here the map changed. The difference between those three steps is the difference between authority and reliability. Authority can make people move. Reliability helps them move in the right direction. There is also a limit to what the story can honestly claim about consequences. We cannot count the hours that were saved, because the source gives no operational record proving the delay that would have occurred. We cannot count fuel that was not burned. We cannot count casualties that did not happen. Counterfactual victories are easy to exaggerate because nothing visible remains behind them. The most defensible result is smaller. A route that the source says contained a map error was corrected before the movement depended on it. That is the proof, and that smaller proof may be more revealing than the larger legend. War creates a strange distance between decision and consequence. The people who draw a route may never see the intersection. The people who approve a timetable may never sit in the lead truck when the road disappears. The men who absorb the delay may never know which mark on which map sent them there. Good staff work closes that distance as much as it can. It forces paper to answer to terrain. Daniel's surveying background, as described by the source, made him sensitive to that relationship. A map could be carefully printed, properly stamped, and carried into a headquarters by experienced people. None of those things made it more true than the road outside. That was the discipline he brought into the room. Not defiance, comparison, map against ground, claim against evidence, rank against consequence. And once the problem was shown clearly enough, the system did what it was supposed to do. It corrected itself. The source adds more biography around Daniel, including family background, civilian plans, and a woman waiting at home. Those details may make a richer character portrait, but they are not necessary to understand the event, and are difficult to separate from later storytelling embellishment without records. The stronger version of the story leaves them aside. A 22-year-old corporal had technical knowledge that became relevant at the worst possible social moment. He used it. A general listened long enough to test it. The route changed, and if the promotion account is accurate, the Army put another stripe on Daniel's sleeve soon afterward. The important sequence is not that a corporal embarrassed a general. It is that a military organization briefly made room for inconvenient accuracy before the inconvenience became operational friction. By the next morning, the briefing room had returned to ordinary work. New papers, new routes, new decisions. Daniel went back to the maps, and the overlay had been corrected.